It's March 1st, 1962, and the skies have grown dark above the German Democratic Republic. A Soviet military train laden with 30 T-55 tanks and hundreds of soldiers is steaming along the Anhalterbahn just outside of Trebbin, 30 kilometres south of Berlin. The train is headed back to Potsdam after a long week of intense military exercises. Coming the other way is an express train bound for Leipzig. As the trains pass each other at the combined speed of nearly 180 km per hour, nothing seems amiss until suddenly a catastrophic vibration and sound ripples up the train. As it turned out, one of the turrets of a T-55 tank had come loose and rotated into the path of the oncoming train. This video will explain the horrific events that followed, deep dive into Soviet military bases of the area, and will shed light on another Cold War accident that was covered up for years. The early 60s was an extremely tense period during the Cold War. By late 1961, the Berlin crisis had escalated with the Checkpoint Charlie face-off, and earlier that year, the erection of the Berlin Wall had completely isolated East from West. Distrust between Nikita Khrushchev and his Western counterparts were approaching unprecedented lows. It felt as if any day now war could break out, with the Soviet military posture at a heightened state of alert across East Germany. During this time, the 20 divisions organised across 6 armies, comprising the group of Soviet forces in Germany, drilled frequently to showcase readiness. Later that year, a massive Warsaw Pact exercise codenamed Baltic Oder was being dreamed up in the minds of Soviet High Command. It was to take place in October 1962 on the border of Poland in the Mecklenburg region, East Germany. With over 32,000 infantry, 250 aircraft and over 5,000 vehicles including tanks, a Soviet counterpunch following a nuclear-first strike by NATO would be simulated. In preparation for manoeuvres like Baltic Oder, training ranges around Berlin were alive with activity, with exercises at the divisional level across all units a frequent event to maintain combat proficiency. Before we get into the evening of March 1st, I would like to explore 2 key elements of this story. The first revolves around the 10th Guards Tank Division, located outside of Potsdam at a barracks known as Krampnitz. And the other is the Juterbog training range in Altes Lager Complex, which if you have seen my Forst Zinner video, you will be familiar with this area. Just outside of Berlin, in the northwest Potsdam region, lies a famous 1930s era barracks facility built for the Wehrmacht cavalry and driving school, known as Krampnitz Kaserne. As was the case with other Nazi-controlled complexes, following the end of World War II, the Red Army captured and converted many of these bases for their own use. Krampnitz would become a major stronghold for the 10th Guards Tank Division, where they were strategically positioned as a forward-deployed striking force that could smash their way to the Rhine in a matter of days if war broke out. The division's structure included 3 tank regiments and 1 motorised rifle regiment, along with supporting artillery, anti-air, reconnaissance, engineer and signal units. The base at Krampnitz was expanded to include garrison buildings for several thousand personnel, warehouses, workshops, theatres and a gymnasium. There was a divisional level hospital, a school, kindergarten and a stadium for parade marches and official events. Old horse stables in this area were converted into tank garages, and nearby, just like at Forst Zinner, they had access to a live-fire artillery and tank gunnery range known as Duberitzer Heide, shown here to the northeast. The over 300 divisional tanks, artillery and other armoured fighting vehicles made use of this range frequently. In late February 1962, the 10th Guards Army, and by extension their specific subunit known as the 248th Motorised Rifle Regiment, were to be rotating down to be involved in a huge regional exercise in the Juterbog training area, 45 kilometres to the south. The 248th would be sending 30 of their best and latest T-55 medium tanks and around 250 to 300 tank crew, maintenance technicians and other support personnel to participate in the exercise. They would be joined in Juterbog by upwards of tens of thousands of other divisional units, all amalgamated in a complex war game occurring over a few weeks and concluding around the end of the month. By 1962, the GSVG had equipped most of its frontline armoured units with the T-55 series medium tank, replacing the older T-54s and outdated IS series heavies. Developed in the post-war period and entering production in the late 1950s, it, alongside its older sibling, the T-54, would become the most prolific tank design in history, with over 100,000 units produced for the Soviet Army and exported to various Warsaw Pact or other friendly nations around the world. The robust 80-plus-year-old design remains in active service with many nations to this day. The T-55 was the first Soviet design to have a nuclear, biological and chemical or NBC system to protect the crew from direct exposure to hazardous conditions outside the vehicle. Featuring a crew of 4, a driver, commander, loader and gunner, the tank, like other Soviet designs, was not spacious by any measure. Primary armament was the reliable D-10T2S 100mm rifled gun, which fires an assortment of ammunition types from anti-tank to high explosive. Adjacent was a 7.62mm machine gun. During transport, the turret would be manually locked in rotation by a lever and a clamp to the rotating portion of the turret ring. This would have to have been engaged manually by the crew and will be a crucial detail in the story for later. In the back was a V55 12-cylinder 580 horsepower diesel engine capable of moving the 36-tonne tank up to a maximum speed of 50 km per hour on level terrain. 2 fuel drums mounted on the rear could extend the 500 km range to 650 km, and a snorkel fitted to the turret would allow river crossings up to 5 metres deep if required. Overall, a ubiquitous and classic design that if one was asked to describe a typical tank to someone who had never seen one before, the T-55 as a Cold War icon would be a likely starting point for a lot of people. Heavy armour such as the T-55 could not be driven long distances on local roads without causing damage to infrastructure. It was therefore Soviet doctrine to mobilise units by rail transport both in peacetime and in war. "45 kilometres to the south lies Juterbog and one of the largest concentrations of Soviet forces in the GDR. A small town by most standards, Juterbog's local German population was dwarfed by upwards of a 40,000 strong Soviet formation. They were spread across the bases of Artillerie Kaserne Juterbog II, Neues Lager and Altes Lager, comprising both mechanised and artillery divisions. Tactical nuclear warheads for the 27th Rocket Brigade were likely also transported here. The Fliegerhorst Juterbog Air Base was a critical asset for Soviet tactical air forces. At the edge of the airfield was likely an S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile battery. Historically, the region had long been of military significance, dating back to the 1800s, where the Prussians originally used the area for shooting practice. In the following years, more land was purchased, more facilities built. The Nazis made use of the area before and during the war for training and artillery. And then finally, the Soviets moved in. We already know about this base at Force Xena and the incident that occurred later in 1988. You can watch my video here if you're interested. The abutting 11,000 hectare training range was conveniently one of the largest open spaces available to forces in East Germany, where live fire artillery and munitions could be thrown around. It's safe to say that there is a lot of history here, and I'll save a more detailed breakdown of each of these complexes for a later video. But for now, just know that the Juterbog was both a crucial strategic asset and a home away from home for Soviet men, women, and their children. Juterbog, located on the junction of the Anhalter Bahn and the Juterbog to Nauen railway, had three key Bahnhofs for rail traffic. Focus of this story is the Alterslager Bahnhof. Lying on the Juterbog-Nauen railway and connecting to the main Berlin-Halle or the Anhalter line meant military trains could either head north towards Berlin or south towards Leipzig without reversal, a key strategic advantage. This station was dedicated to loading and unloading mechanised units, tanks, and facilitating large-scale troop movements. Heavy equipment was needed, including gantry cranes and ramps. During the exercise of February 1962, we can assume the 248th Guards units from Krampnitz and the military convoy would have had to come to and departed from this station at the conclusion of the exercise. At the head of the special military train was the venerable Deutsche Reichsbahn Class 52 locomotive, a legend. Commonly referred to as a Kriegslok or Kriegslokomotive. It was developed during World War II as part of Nazi Germany's efforts to accelerate locomotive production for the Eastern Front. It would become the most produced variant in the Kriegslok family, with over 7,000 units manufactured between 1942 and 1950. Built from mostly steel, it was a simple design. Wartime locomotives were targets and not expected to last long, so the unit forgoes expensive metals such as bronze, copper or brass in favour of cheaper alternatives. What resulted was a robust and efficient design that would stand the test of time. The 52 features a 2-10-0 decapod wheel configuration, providing good traction on poor rail infrastructure. Power via the valve gear is provided to 5 of the 6 wheel axle groups. Fueled by coal, 9 tonnes of which were stored in the tender alongside 16,000 litres of water, the locomotive produced around 1,600 horsepower and can haul 1,200 tonnes at a maximum speed of 80 km per hour. Although for safety, heavy freight trains typically travelled at around 60 km per hour. The crew comprised an engineer driver and a fireman. Following World War II, many units remained in Soviet-occupied territory. The East German Deutsche Reichsbahn would go on to inherit hundreds of them. This solidified the class as the backbone of logistical freight across its network in the years prior to the widespread adoption of diesel locomotives in the later 1970s. As the GSVG relied heavily on East German rail infrastructure for their own logistics, Class 52s would often be assigned to haul military freight for the Soviets. The specific military train headed back to Krampnitz, comprising 30 tanks plus personnel and equipment, would have been upwards of at least 2,200 tonnes, maybe more. This meant that the train that day would require not one, but 2 Class 52s in a double-headed configuration. Even then, the two Kriegsloks would have been heaving at almost their maximum capacity. The training exercise was over, and the 248th was scheduled to return north to Krampnitz. The route would see them head north along the Anhalterbahn via Juterbog, past Forst Sinna and Ludwigswalde, on a convoy designated the Special Train 19-198. That afternoon, between 1400 and 1700, the 30 T-55 tanks were driven up the ramps at Elter's Lager and chained to SSY-55 type flat cars as shown here. Turrets were rotated forward in the direction of travel. The locking mechanisms engaged, but the barrels are not secured with any other means. To fit the enormous train in the station, the loaded wagons would have to have been shunted to temporary sidings whilst other loading was completed. When it was time, the 250 Soviets boarded, but they were not to travel in comfort. As was common during the Cold War, Soviet personnel travelling by military freight would be packed into standard boxcars with no seating, 30 to 50 people per car and standing room only. It would have been horrible inside with maybe a small lantern and no ventilation. The train returning to Krampnitz had 7 or 8 such boxcars for this purpose, up the rear of the formation behind the flat cars. At the very end of the train would have been a typical PR-14 or similar brake wagon. At around 1730, the Soviet officer and train commander salutes the 4 East German locomotive crew and boards the rear of the train, assuming control of the convoy. A departure window has been granted, and civilian traffic at Juterbog will be directed to wait in their sidings. The 52s are brought up to steam, and the 2,200-tonne train slowly pulls away from the station at around 1800 hours. Meanwhile, 55 kilometres north at Berlin Ostbahnhof, an East German high-speed express train bound for Leipzig departs on schedule. The locomotive, likely a Deutsche Reichsbahn Class 1, was capable of 120 km per hour in a standard configuration of around 10 Schürzenwagen, with compartments off an adjacent corridor. Between 500 to 700 passengers were on board. The trip begins uneventful. The Soviets in their boxcars are talking amongst themselves, sneaking a drink or being lulled to sleep by the movement of the train. In just over a few hours, they would be back in their barracks at Krampnitz, with many looking forward to returning there after the exhausting training they'd just been through. A little while ago, they passed through Luckenwald and were approaching Trebbin, the special train now steaming north around its max permissible speed of 60 km per hour. Over on the express train, Siegfried Morgenstern, a passenger in one of the lead coaches, excuses himself from the compartment to go and have a smoke in the corridor. As both trains neared the level crossing at barrier post 39 of the old Federal Highway F101, a sickening disaster was about to unfold. Towards the rear of the formation, one of the T-55's locking pins failed, and the turret and barrel began rotating to the left and protruding into the adjacent trackway. Just ahead, the express train travelling south at 120 km per hour screams past the front of the convoy. A lot of things happen very quickly, so I will slow it down so we can step through each sequence of events. Firstly, it was dark and there's no chance the engineers of the DR-01 locomotive could see the tank barrel in the trackway, nor could they have stopped in time. The barrel first struck the side of the express locomotive, wedged itself and sheared off. The debris then proceeded to open up the first passenger coach like a tin can. Siegfried, who was halfway through a cigarette and looking out the window, was thrown from the train and killed instantly. The nearly 1-ton barrel then reportedly sliced through carriages 3, 5 and 7, killing a further East German passenger and injuring others with flying splinters. Miraculously, most of the people on the express train were unharmed due to it not derailing and the layout of the Schützenwagen with its offset compartments. The effect on the military train, however, was catastrophic. When the barrel first sheared off, the violent force wrenched the 36-ton hull backwards. The tank toppled and fell directly onto the ballast between its flat car and the next. The massive obstacle then proceeded to cause the following wagons to derail and pile up. One after another, flat cars laden with tanks and the trailing wooden troop cars telescoped into a colossal wreckage heap. Heavy T-55s were thrown around like toys, lying on their side or upside down across the embankment. The boxcars had it the worst. Simply constructed from sheet metal and timber, they splintered to kindling in the pile-up. The soldiers standing inside, who had no idea what was happening, found themselves suddenly smashed and cut to ribbons. It was horrific. Firefighters from nearby Trebbin were about to head home for the night when the call came in. Something terrible had just happened. Rushing to the area, they could only describe a scene like something from the apocalypse. Even experienced men are shaken and disturbed by what they can see. The pile-up of twisted metal was estimated between 40 and 50 metres long and as high as a multi-storey house. Making matters worse, the accident occurred in the rural outskirts of Trebbin, where the track enters a small forest, making access challenging. Furthermore, the scene could only be illuminated by whatever means were available: emergency vehicle headlights and hand torches. Allegedly, taxi drivers from Juterbog are ordered to go and drive as fast as possible to the DEFA film studio an hour away in Potsdam in search of floodlights. One eyewitness, Herbert Bauer, a local chemistry teacher who was on his way home to Luckenwalde at the time of the accident, describes hearing the choir of sirens approaching from the surrounding villages. He recounts how they were stopped on the road first by local police and then by a Soviet officer. They weren't allowed to pass the level crossing. The soldiers riding in the box wagons had been subjected to terrible trauma. Many were grievously wounded or killed outright, some trapped in the mangled wreckage. Bauer's account speaks of rescue teams hauling out screaming victims with horrific injuries. One badly wounded soldier had a splintered plank of wood speared through his abdomen and lower back. Estimations of the enormous Soviet casualties vary, but all are grim. East German rescue personnel would later account that between 70 and 90 Soviet soldiers died at the crash site alone. Over and over, trucks and ambulances arrived on the scene and started to remove the casualties, but it wasn't enough. In a move of desperation, passing motorists were flagged down, their drivers conscripted, and vehicles commissioned into a medical convoy back to the only hospital in the area with an operating theatre, Luckenwalde. Many lives may have been saved by the efforts of these unsung East German heroes, who carried bleeding Soviets in the backs of their cars. In the immediate aftermath, the priority for the Soviet command was to contain the incident without attracting any more public attention. Soviet military and East German police, the Volkspolizei, quickly sealed off the area in a large cordon either side of the crash site. Reinhold Pohl, a 29-year-old station chief and Deutsche Reichsbahn representative, remembers how he was ordered by Soviet authorities to not fill out an accident report. No written records or accounts were to be documented under any circumstances about the military train. GDR Volkspolizei are told to only investigate and report on the express train casualties. The incident had now become an operation in state secrecy. That night, whilst wounded and dying soldiers were lying in the hospital in Luckenwalde, Soviet army officers barged in and demanded custody over them. Testimony from doctors and nurses, only revealed years later, described how, before dawn, officers arrived with trucks and insisted on evacuating every Soviet casualty regardless of their medical condition, including those who were just in surgery only moments ago. This extraordinary action saw all the wounded removed from the care of GDR doctors and nurses to control and prevent the spread of information, but likely contributed to more unnecessary deaths. Back at the crash site, the Soviet army had been called up from the Juterbog garrison and had mobilised heavy equipment to clear the site as quickly as possible. By the next day, March 2nd, the wreckage of the military train and the damaged express coaches had been removed or pulled aside, and rail repair work began immediately. It only took a week or so until the line was reopened as if nothing had happened. As I've already discussed, the Soviet Union's military leadership and the East German authorities went to great lengths to cover up the disaster. In 1962, admitting that a Soviet tank caused a deadly train wreck on GDR soil would have been political suicide and could undermine the image of Soviet competence and the GDR public safety. Whilst propaganda outwardly portrayed the two as being close friends, the reality was that the East German population housed a deep-seated resentment towards the Soviets. East Germany's tightly controlled press barely reported the accident at all. No headlines or photographs, and no detailed reports were released. In fact, the GDR government only acknowledged one victim. 2 days later, a brief note in a Potsdam newspaper mentioned that a railway accident had occurred near Trebbin, resulting in the death of one German passenger and a few injuries. Locals in Trebbin, railway workers and hospital staff were warned not to speak about what they saw. Herbert Bauer, our eyewitness, recalled that the very next day at his school, colleagues advised him to keep quiet about what he had experienced. East German citizens understood that a veil of secrecy had descended. Many simply knew that there had been an accident involving Soviet forces and that one should not pry. The Soviet military, for its part, treated the incident as highly classified. All Soviet soldiers involved were under orders not to discuss it. Soviet families of the deceased were kept in the dark. In fact, numerous Soviet soldiers who died in GDR accidents were often buried in East Germany without much fanfare. There are even records or letters from family of the deceased asking after long-lost loved ones, only to receive little to no responses of any substance in return. This kind of story was likely common. Families received a perfunctory notice of death, possibly citing a training accident or similar euphemism, and nothing more. Because of these measures, the Trebbin rail disaster became something of a hidden event. It was not widely known or officially acknowledged in either East Germany or the USSR during the Cold War. Only local memories and secret archives held the truth. The GDR regime's effort to maintain the facade of normalcy went so far that by the time of reunification in 1990, almost no official documentation of the incident had surfaced publicly. It was, as one historian called it, perhaps the most mysterious railway catastrophe in GDR history, leaving behind no published photos and only eyewitness tales. Despite the secrecy, ripples from the event can be found if you look close enough. According to sources, the Trebbin disaster directly influenced improved regulations for transporting tanks by rail. It became mandatory to physically secure tank barrels with steel cables. This practice continued in both the Soviet Union and East German armies, and is still a standard practice for rail transport of armoured vehicles today. The Soviet soldiers killed in the catastrophe, of whom numbered at least 70, but likely much more, were not repatriated to the USSR. Instead, they were interred in East Germany, often in military cemeteries near their garrisons. Decades later, evidence of these burials would come to light. In the early 2000s, a German stone masonry company, restoring headstones at the Soviet garrison cemetery in Potsdam, discovered a cluster of gravestones, at least 15 of them, all bearing the same date of death, March 1st, 1962. These graves almost certainly belonged to soldiers who perished in the Trebbin disaster. Graves of the others are likely out there somewhere, in overlooked locations waiting to be found. Internally, there may have been disciplinary actions. The Soviet officers in charge of the train or the loading process might have faced military reprimand or worse for their negligence. However, details of any internal inquiry or court-martial have not surfaced in open sources, so we can only speculate. There is a theory that the T-55 had a crew inside who purposely slew the turret whilst underway for target practice. I find this hard to believe though. The crew had just been at a week-long exercise and would have been tired and looking forward to coming home, not fooling around in the turret. It would only be after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War that some information bubbled to the surface. The Juterbog Garrison History Bulletin published some details in 2009, including eyewitness estimates of the 70 to 90 casualties and noting the press silence. In 2012, on the 50th anniversary of the crash, the regional newspaper, MAZ, ran a feature that would detail almost 100 Soviet soldiers died in a rail accident south of Trebbin. These articles, and a subsequent in-depth eyewitness narrative by Hubert Bauer in 2013, finally brought the long-suppressed story to light in the local media. Bauer's article, pointedly titled "Reckless Officers and Courageous Medics," highlighted both the Soviet commanders' harsh actions and the heroism of the East German doctors that night. In 2018, German television produced a documentary episode which dramatised the accident and the rescue efforts. You can find this documentary in German on YouTube. This included interviews with remaining witnesses and even a modest reenactment filmed on location in Trebbin, finally acknowledging the event in popular media. The story, once a guarded secret, is now recognised as one of the worst train disasters in German history and a stark example of Cold War secrecy. Today, the Trebbin rail disaster stands as a dramatic and cautionary tale. It underscores the dangers inherent in military transports and the extreme measures authorities took to control information. Thanks to the perseverance of local historians and eyewitnesses who eventually shared their stories, we now have a somewhat detailed account of what happened on that fateful evening in 1962. As more archives, perhaps even Soviet military archives, are opened, additional details may yet emerge. But even now, over 60 years later, the basics are clear. A single unsecured tank turret caused a chain reaction and a crash that killed scores of young soldiers and 2 civilians.